Hi, everyone. A little quick housekeeping before we get started. This session is being recorded, and we will send you a copy of the recording and a follow-up email so you can learn a little bit more about this topic. And we encourage you to ask questions throughout the conversations. We will be answering them in the Q&A section. All right. Welcome to Beyond Resilience, where leadership stops being a solo act. I'm Kathryn Coyle, Head of Coaching Experience at Torch, and I am thrilled to be joined by Dr. Vijay Pendakur, author of Alchemy of Talent, and he specializes in helping leaders build high-performing teams that thrive through disruption. Vijay, there's a lot being asked of leaders right now, and often the common advice is to be more resilient. But what if resilience isn't enough because leadership wasn't meant to be carried alone? What's driving your thinking that leadership can't be a solo act anymore?
Well, that's a great place to start the conversation. I think that when I'm working with teams right now, some form of resilience or at least fatigue, right? The desire for resilience comes up in every conversation, right? So I think um, the the idea of team level resilience is really where you and I know, have a lot of shared perspective on this, right? That if we expect the leader to be resilient, but we're not preparing the team to generate resilience as an outcome, then we're kind of setting everybody up to fail, right? So a couple of things to zoom up a level, right, is the reason we may need a new approach to thinking about resilience is first and foremost because we're dealing with a different arena of work. And the thing that I believe has changed is just the level, the frequency and severity of disruption that's occurring, right? When any of us are in our businesses, it feels like every 30 to 60 days, there's some huge macro event happening that isn't even in our business, right? That is causing us to have to rethink our roadmaps, rethink our tech stack, rethink our how we measure things, right? Let alone changes that are happening inside the business at the micro level, right? Which is, the reorgs, budget cuts, scope creep, AI overwhelm, right? So there's so many changes, and I would say since 2020, we've kind of been in this fevered pitch of responding to one disruption before we've even really made sense of the last disruption. And I think a what this calls for us to do is revisit our playbook of what leadership looks like and what teaming looks like,
Mm.
so that we can actually um, find a pathway to thriving in what I believe is to be our new normal. And so if living in disruption is our new normal, then we actually have to move from where a lot of my coaching and facilitating conversations are with teams right now, where they're using outdated tools. They're really using like change management tools from the before times, right? Which function like, okay, we've got one change, it's very well understood, and we're going to lead through this change, right, to a stable new normal. And the leader is trying to do old school change management, right? And it's not working, right? Everybody is just fractured. And the metaphor I bring forward that people find to be helpful is change management. The way we came up, right, in the before times, was about building a bridge. There's a change. The leader's job is to shine a light and help people see the way towards new stable ground. And that's not serving us well anymore. I would argue that leading and teaming in 2025 is about learning to surf. The waves are going to keep coming, and we actually have to redevelop a set of skills that allow us to stay on top of the wave. We're not waiting for the waves to stop coming so we can exist in a stable new normal. We're actually changing gears so that the whole act of being on this team is simply about catching wave after wave after wave. And I'll extend that metaphor across the conversation we have today to make sure it makes sense for our audience.
It's so powerful, and just from an imagery standpoint, so much more dynamic and representative of what it's really like, not just to lead in today's environment, but just for all of us to exist, whether you're an IC or a leader. And I know through my work as a coach, even the most seasoned leaders right? They still fall into the trap of trying to hold too much, and there's too many changes on their plate to think in that linear bridge-like fashion. I know you've talked about resilience and burnout being structural versus individual. As a leadership coach, we coach the individual inside the organization, and that means there's some great benefits that come from being part of that system of the organization, but there's also many inherent challenges. And one we see a lot is like the hero culture, where performance reviews and incentives are all about individual performance. So, how are you helping companies and leaders recognize when this is bigger than, just their leaders needing better time management or, more change management skills? Because we hear that a lot too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, there's a couple of different things that I think are really important here. First, let me clarify that idea of burnout versus resilience, right? I think we do the workforce and each other as human beings a huge disservice when we tell people that they should get grittier in the face of burnout. Because burnout, if it's endemic, right? If it's something that's affecting a large part of the workforce in an organization, that's a litmus. It's a proxy for the organization needing to change, right? Burnout means that there's something wrong with the way that work is being divvied up, the way that the executive team is functioning, a lack of clarity around what we're solving for, breaches in trust that haven't been addressed yet. So oftentimes burnout is the canary in the coal mine. It
Mm,
signals that there's a policy, system, structure, or culture issue that needs to be addressed badly, right? Resilience is about each person's journey towards managing themselves as part of a dynamic system and how they can continue to grow forward. And so, what the reason I love putting a spotlight on burnout, and as an HR, a former HR executive, we've got to redesign work if we want people to not burn out. But on the individual level, as somebody who coaches and facilitates around team effectiveness, we all have the chance to look at challenges in our lives and headwinds and not bounce back, but actually change forward. And my
mm,
thing on resilience is that we, for us to be resilient, we actually have to think about what we're willing to change. It's not about taking the weekend and going to Mexico and laying on the beach, although I love that. Like, hey, let's all do that. But that's not the call for resilience, right? That's not actually how we replug and charge our batteries. We charge our batteries by redesigning our personal system of how we
mm,
engage in work. And so, that's a high level thing there, right? Around burnout versus resilience. I think the thing you're making is when we start to point at the individual versus the team, right? So let's talk about that. I know you do a lot of work in this space too, right? But the team is the unit of performance in most complex organizations, but most of the way we set up the incentive structures, the performance appraisal system, the LMS, the learning management system, is all about the individual. And so, part of, I think, what I feel so called to put the spotlight on is how do we actually change the team's ability to function, and reward teams that function at a higher level. So, things that I think are really helpful, that are more tactical than that kind of abstraction, is setting up a team burnout hygiene. So when I'm talking with a leader and a team, it's not all on the leader, right? And they're saying like, look, it's our organization has gone through some changes. We want to be more resilient as a team. I'll often say, okay, well, what is your routine? What is your rhythm of task clarity? And the team will be like, what do you mean? I go, well, on what basis do you revisit who's doing what and why? It's such a simple thing, right? But going through on a regular basis, once a month, what are the major tasks of this team? Who's the driver? Who's supporting the work? And who needs to be informed along the way? Like basic racy chart kind of stuff actually helps reduce inefficiency. Because part of what happens in endless disruption is that role clarity starts to dissolve very naturally. And so teams that move from bridge building to surfing have routines that allow them to reestablish role clarity on a regular basis. And that's part of resilience hygiene for the team. Another thing is on a quarterly basis, doing something like an effort versus impact plot, taking the major work of the team. And if you think about an XY axis, right? There's four quadrants on that. And if one axis is effort and the other is impact, looking at the key objectives of that team and plotting them out. Where is our maximal effort? Where is our maximal impact? And if there are things that are high effort, low impact, they either need to be redesigned or they need to be sunsetted, right? Because these are the kinds of task hygiene things that allow the team to actually not carry inefficiencies that just show up when you have to pivot, right? And so oftentimes when I'm working with a team on clarity and effectiveness, they'll do one of these effort versus impact plots and they realize that like 30% of the calories of the team are being spent on things that are really arduous that don't actually produce their wins. But they've just carried that debt because of organizational change over and over and over again. And it's been a year or 18 months since they did a spring cleaning. And the notion of an annual or biennial spring cleaning comes from the before times. These things need to be part of our weekly, monthly, quarterly cadence if we're going to learn to surf.
The concept of a hygiene just changes things so dramatically because right, hygiene is part of our daily routine, which is exactly what you're talking about, of really integrating practices and processes into the work. And I know we do IC coaching as well, and we hear constantly about role ambiguity and navigating ambiguity and existing in the gray. And well, yes, some of that is a reality. It does not need to be at the level that it exists today for so many people if these kinds of practices were being employed more routinely. So let's talk about building teams that move together. That surfing analogy, to me, it's not just the leader on the surfboard, but it's really the whole team on the surfboard, and how all these responses to wind and waves and splashes, and how they're reacting and moving in such a coordinated fashion. So can you give us a real example from your experience, about a team that's transitioned from everything flowing and relying on the leader to the team being really responsible for that dynamic movement?
Sure. Yeah. So two things. One, Kathryn, I did see a question in chat that I can answer quickly because we're sort of shifting gears right now, and I wanted to name Pancho. Thank you so much for the question in chat. Great call out, right? I use the phrase canary in the coal mine, which suggests a leading indicator, and I 100% agree with you. I need to fix my verbiage here. I think that burnout is a lagging indicator. By the time people are burning out, then the system has already produced some pretty big collateral damage. Just a quick note here for all my HR operators on the call. We pay attention to a lot of lagging indicators in HR. One of the huge problems is everything from employee sentiment to, regrettable exits to, promotion rates. There are so many things that we notice as kind of key metrics in the HR space and in the talent development and pathing space that are all lagging indicators. So we've got to get a lot better at active listening so that we can rely on some leading indicators that don't involve people ending up in really bad situations before we try and correct. So I just wanted to name that.
Yeah, and some of your practices that you're talking about, like these hygiene practices, can be leading indicators, right? Are teams doing, these practices on a routine enough and regular enough cadence?
Yes. So thank you, Pancho, for that great nudge. So Kathryn, to take it back to your question, let me share an example. So I started leading teams in my mid-20s and worked at 5 universities across the United States, leading large and complex teams in research environments, and student experience redesign was a lot of my focus. Shifted into employee experience work in global corporations and worked at 3 global public technology companies with teams on multiple continents. So let me choose an example of a time that we got out of that hub and spoke trap where everything is on the leader. I'll pick an example that I talked about recently, actually, with a group. I started a new leadership role. It was my last academic post before I shifted into corporate leadership. And I was the dean of students at a large Ivy League university. So elite, highly selective, very, very large, complex research university. And the dean of students runs the incidents response team. So I led the team that responded to all of the emergencies, from sort of health and safety risks with students and sort of suicide, alcohol overdose, to a lot of the DEI flare-ups that we were having, to public safety. I partnered with campus police on public safety issues. So a lot of like needing to be really agile and responsive in a dynamic and high-risk system, oftentimes having to solve problems with limited and imperfect data. And if we make mistakes, we end up on the front page of the New York Times, because that's what it means to lead the incident response team at an Ivy League university. And this was in the period in the late, like 2016, 2017, when there was a lot of high profile, controversial speakers showing up on college campuses, and the events getting shut down because of disturbances in the room that would lead to the whole event being canceled. And I was in my first month on the job, and the president of the university asked me to swing by her office. And I was like really kind of excited. I was like, oh, the president wants to meet with me, and maybe she wants to say, welcome aboard, right? I go to the president's office and she's like, hey, welcome aboard. We've got a problem. And so an extremely famous US politician was going to come to campus. Students had fundraised with an outside entity to get a boatload of money to bring somebody to campus who was going to be very divisive and controversial. And the president basically said, we've got 90 days to prepare, and my expectation is that this event does not get canceled. And it was very clear, like it was very like, this is on you, figure it out, right? And
don't end up in the paper.
Yeah, exactly, right. So I pull the incident response team together, and look, I'm 3-4 weeks on the job, and I pull the team together, and I have my normal energy here. I'm like, all right, folks, we've got a big challenge. Let me tell you what's going on. And so give me a sense of like what's happened here or at other campuses that you're aware of that's led to failure. Like let's debug the system first, right? This is generally where you want to start. Like, why have things gone wrong in the past? And I thought it would be everybody leaning in and sharing ideas. It was like crickets. Nobody would speak. I'm like, what is going on here, right? And so I kind of wrapped the meeting up, knew something was really broken, right? And then started having one-on-ones and asking open-ended, curiosity-based discovery questions in these one-on-ones. And what became apparent to me is that trust, belonging, and connection, the three kind of volume knobs that we need to rely on to lead through disruption, were all at zero, right? There had been some major breaches of trust and belonging connection on this group, where they felt like the first person to speak would probably face consequences, or if they tried to speak truth, that the university wasn't actually interested in their perspective, so that they weren't being taken seriously. So there's a number of things that I had to try and address. And time pressure was high, right? The execution pressure was high. We were being expected to design a solution that didn't exist. And the team that was supposed to help me was leaned away from me. And so I pulled the team back together after a couple of those one-on-ones and just started very differently. And I said, hey, I realize I expected you all to essentially do a trust fall with me, if you remember the old bonding exercise, right? And you don't even know me. So let's start again, right? First, let me tell you who I am, where I come from, the kinds of things I've experienced in my life, my perspective on managing emergencies, and the times that I've failed, right? And so I just what I was doing was modeling some level of authenticity and vulnerability so that people's shoulders could drop, right? Like I was making a bid for trust by showing up as more human. And then the second thing I did was just start by, Brene Brown has this wonderful quote that vulnerability scales small to large. People don't show up and take heroic risks at the start. So I just started leading our weekly syncs with an increasing level of like, what can you bring forward that feels very small and tactical, but I was staying laser focused on inviting courage by when people would share ideas or a little pushback. Hey, I love what you're doing. Me as a facilitator, right? Noticing and affirming. I see you're challenging each other's ideas or my ideas. I really appreciate that. That's how we're going to get better as a team, right? So having to buy back trust and belonging and connection on that team through the way I led our weekly syncs. And I also initiated two rituals. One was a 5 minutes of fame ritual where we took 5 minutes at the beginning of stand up to notice something that had gone well in the last week. We were always managing difficult issues across campus. There was always a way to notice, hey, so and so showed up at 2 a.m. on an emergency response call, and just the level of gravitas they brought into that situation. I know you had to be tired. Just shout out to John for the way you handled that. Like trying to build a flywheel of recognition on the team was something that helped bolster that sense of belonging. And I also brought forward a ritual that I called fantastic fudge ups. You can call it other things if you want, but where we started to share things we were trying that didn't work. So we could destigmatize mistakes. Because in any innovation centered team, and I'm looking at who's on the call here, right? We got a lot of teams that need to innovate. You have to take down the threat level on mistakes. Mistakes are necessary for innovation. So in Fantastic Fudge Ups, we started to depathologize failure. And finally, somebody said to me, right as we were wrapping up the meeting, we're packing up our bags, and they just said, hey, can I tell you what I think is going on at some of these speaker events? And I was like, sure. And they shared their perspective, and I won't walk the whole thing out here because this has already been a really long answer, but that turned into the solution to the problem.
You know what, to reflect back as you're talking about yourself and how you made the shift, you're calling yourself the facilitator. And so you're already in how you're viewing yourself as a leader, changing that that spoken wheel kind of image for yourself, and instead shifting it to being more of a weaver, creating an interconnected network or web amongst your team, right? You've removed yourself from that creating that visual of kind of the spoken wheel leadership model. And I know that when I'm coaching leaders, it becomes a really pivotal moment when they start to see themselves and think about leading a team as a unit instead of leading a set of however many individuals report to them. And you are tapping into that collective intelligence of that team, to really make that dynamic shift from the bridge to the surfing model, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah.
um what are some oh
Let me
yeah.
like, as we think about surfing, right? We don't have to always invent new things. There have been teams that have operated in endless disruption for a very long time, right? Even when times felt more stable, there was sectors or specific domains or types of jobs where we can actually learn from their lived experience of endless disruption. And so there's really good evidence-based research. And I put all of this into the Alchemy of Talent, right? Which is, how do we look at really high functioning sports teams that are in flow sports, like a basketball team, right? And look at the way that coaches lead basketball teams who have to dynamically adjust in the moment of performance when they realize they're not doing things the way they should, right? If it was all on the coach, you don't have a winning basketball team. But what the best coaches do is they empower the team to actually coach each other and coach the coach. Same thing with special operations groups in the military, right? These are often small tactical units that are deployed into areas of extraordinary uncertainty. And what you know about special operations groups is that they actually empower the team to speak to the leader and say, here's what I'm seeing. I don't think that's the right call. They don't use command and control, which is oftentimes associated with the military. But actually, if you get into the units that are in the most volatile situations, they don't use the same model of command and control. It is much more of the team as a unit that is leveraging trust, belonging, connection in order to produce innovations and outcomes that are not possible in a hub and spoke leader-led model.
Yeah, and so and really kind of what you're describing about the sports teams and the special forces is about how they're not over indexing on individual growth. They're really working together. Everybody is involved in participating in the evolution of the team.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so I know we're about to shift into Q&A. I would just say that as we think about for the leaders on the call or people who support leaders on the call, as we think about moving from trying to cross a single bridge into this art of surfing, um, there's the two things I'll end with is it's all behavioral, right? So if the leader that is saying the right things but not doing the right things, this isn't going to work. And so the entirety of my practice is around how do you show up differently tomorrow? And that's why I always mention rituals, right? Things that actually make a behavioral commitment to doing something different with the team. And the second thing is that the infrastructure for surfing is trust, belonging, and connection. These are not feel good, cultural, nice to haves. They're actually the scaffolding that allow teams to ride waves. And that's one of the biggest shifts in the Fortune 500 enterprise organizations that I work with. I'm always reminding them these are not fluffy culture icing on the cakes. These are the scaffolding that actually allow your teams to function differently in 2025 the way we need to if we're going to unlock the best work of our lives.
Yeah. Uh, what a great kind of capstone message. As we shift into the Q&A, we've got a great question here about how these principles that we're talking about, how do they apply when you're managing hybrid or remote teams?
So most of us at this point in time, right, are managing hybrid and remote teams in some way, shape, or form. So I think that a lot of the act of intentionality becomes so important when you're not sitting hip to hip with your team. When you're co-located, it's frankly, it actually takes less intentionality to generate some level of connection because there's so many shared experiences that are just part of the way that you have lunches and coffees and you know what I mean? The small moments of serendipity that come about when somebody shows up at work and you see them in the morning and they look frazzled and you go, "Hey, Kathryn, what's going on? Are you okay?" And they go, "My kid was really sick over the weekend and I'm just a little bit worried." And so for you as a leader, you now get the ability to the next day say, "Kathryn, is your son feeling better?" That's an amazing moment where you're earning trust and connection from your team member, right? Well, when you're not hip to hip, you actually have to build practices that allow you to get that same data. So the thing I would say to the leaders on the call is, what is your intentional investment in gathering data that allows you to lead for connection? And so that means that we have to have rituals like in meetings, inviting people to share quickly. It doesn't have to take over the whole agenda, but I use a ritual called wired, tired, and inspired, right? Wired is tell me something that you're excited about from your life, right? Outside of work. Tired is what's something that's bumming you out outside of work. And inspired is what's on the horizon. What are you looking forward to? It takes 60 seconds for each person on the team to go through and share their wired, tired, and inspired. But if it's a regular part of your weekly or biweekly meeting, people actually start to look forward to this, right? And all of that allows the team to, not just the leader, to go, "Oh, I remember you shared in your Inspired the Dave Matthews tickets you had. That concert happened, right? How was it?" And those kinds of moments you actually have to engineer into hybrid and remote so that we get back the connection and the serendipity that maybe we're able to access more easily when we're together.
And it takes the intention, but it doesn't take extra time because we're doing work anyway. So we may as well do work in a more connected, trusting way. So just thank you so much for such a rich conversation, Vijay. So many insights and tools about the future of leadership not being a solo act and how leaders can really create the conditions to help teams succeed together. For everybody listening, we will be sending you all these great takeaways in our recap blog. If you are interested in exploring these team dynamics further, You can explore some of our coaching programs, like Disruption Proof Teams, which is a partnership between Dr. Pendakur and Torch. And we are also getting ready to launch team coaching, which will help build teaming skills also. So please reach out to us. We thank you for joining us and appreciate your time. Have a wonderful day.
Bye, everybody.